The year is 1919. A chilling autumn rain whispers through the skeletal branches of the Kentucky hills, slicking the muddy track that serves as a road. For a lone traveler named Elias Thorne, a man returning from a war that had stolen the world's innocence, the flickering lantern of a distant boarding house is a beacon in the oppressive dark. It is called the Weary Pilgrim, a name that promises respite. But respite is not what this place offers. Inside, the air is thick with the aroma of wood smoke and a simmering stew, a rich, savory scent that clings to the heavy wool of his coat and promises to chase the cold from his bones. The proprietor, a woman named Alara Kane, moves with a spectral grace, her face a pale, unreadable mask in the lamplight. She ladles the thick, meaty broth into a bowl, her silence more profound than the drumming rain outside. Elias is hungry, exhausted. He lifts the spoon to his lips, the warmth spreading through him. It is delicious, unusually so. He takes another spoonful, then another. His spoon scrapes against something hard, something unyielding at the bottom of the earthenware bowl. It is not bone, not gristle. Curious, he fishes it out with his fingers, holding it up to the flickering light. It is small, white, and oddly shaped. He wipes the clinging gravy away. And then a horrifying, sickening realization washes over him, colder than the November rain. It is a human tooth. A molar with a small, metallic glint of a filling. The stew in his stomach turns to lead. The savory aroma suddenly becomes a gagging, macabre stench. He looks up at Alara Kane, who is watching him from the shadows, her eyes holding a placid, terrifying emptiness. The door is barred. The windows are shuttered, and the horrifying cold case of the weary pilgrim is about to claim another soul who has vanished into the unforgiving hills of Kentucky. To understand the disturbing events that unfolded at the weary pilgrim, one must first understand the place from which they grew. The Appalachian Hills of eastern Kentucky in 1919 were a world unto themselves, a place of deep shadows and deeper secrets. This was a land carved by hardship, where communities were bound by blood, suspicion, and a folklore as old and gnarled as the trees. The Great War had ended, but peace felt like a distant rumor here. Sons returned from the trenches of France not as heroes, but as haunted men, their spirits as broken as their bodies. They came back to a land still reeling from the Spanish flu pandemic, which had swept through these isolated hollers like a vengeful spirit, leaving behind a trail of fresh graves and hollowed-out families. Poverty was a constant, unwelcome guest, and the coal companies were beginning to sink their black teeth into the mountainsides, promising prosperity but often delivering little more than debt and dust. In this environment, strangers were not just curiosities, they were threats. An unfamiliar face could mean a revenue agent, a company man, or something far worse. Trust was a currency scarcer than gold, reserved for kin and neighbors whose histories were known and whose sins were, at the very least, familiar. It was a place where people, especially those just passing through, itinerant workers, lone travelers, salesmen, could disappear without a ripple. The wilderness was vast and unforgiving, a perfect accomplice for any macabre act. The land itself seemed designed to keep secrets, its dense forests and hidden caves capable of swallowing a man whole, leaving no trace but a whisper of a memory that would soon fade with the changing seasons. This was the stage for our horrifying story. In the heart of this isolated landscape, nestled in a small, forgotten valley known to locals as Hemlock Hollow, stood the boarding house. The Weary Pilgrim was a two-story clapboard structure, its paint peeling like sunburnt skin, its posture slumped as if weary from the weight of the secrets it held within. It was owned and operated by Alara Kane, a widow in her late 40s. To the few who passed through the hollow, she was an unremarkable figure. A woman etched by hardship, with hair the color of ash pulled back in a severe bun and hands that were perpetually raw and chapped. She had inherited the boarding house from her parents, who had themselves inherited it from theirs. The Kane family had been in Hemlock Hollow for generations, a quiet, insular line of people who kept to themselves. They were not well liked, but they were a fixture, as much a part of the landscape as the creek that carved through the valley floor. Rumors clung to the Kane name like the damp moss on the trees. Old stories, passed down in hushed tones around hearths, spoke of their ancestors practicing forbidden folk magic during the lean years of the Civil War, of strange rituals performed under the dark of a new moon. Most dismissed it as the idle gossip of superstitious mountain folk. After all, Ilara's boarding house served a purpose. It was one of the only places for a traveler to rest their head for 50 miles in any direction. It offered a warm bed, a roof against the rain, and Ilara's famous hearty stew, a recipe she claimed that had been in her family for a century. The stew was the one thing for which she was known, the one thing people spoke of with a strange mixture of admiration and unease. It was said to be richer, more satisfying than any other meal in the county. A secret ingredient, she would say with a rare, thin smile, was what made it so special. The disappearances began subtly, like the first chill of winter. In a region where people were often transient, a person failing to arrive at their destination was hardly cause for alarm. The first was a peddler named Silas Griggs in the spring of 1918. He was known to travel the mountain circuits, his cart laden with pots, pans, and cheap trinkets. He was last seen heading towards Hemlock Hollow, intending to stay the night at the Weary Pilgrim. He was never seen again. His cart was found months later, overturned in a ravine miles away, its contents picked clean by scavengers, both animal and human. The local sheriff, a weary, overworked man named Jebediah Thorne, chalked it up to a robbery gone wrong. The hills were full of desperate men. It was a tragic but unremarkable event. A few months later, a young man, a discharged soldier making his way home to Tennessee, also vanished. His family sent letters, but in the chaos of post-war America, a lost soldier was just another name on a tragically long list. He, too, was rumored to have sought shelter at Ilara Kane's establishment. Then came another and another. A railroad surveyor, a union organizer from up north, a woman fleeing a troubled past, each one a solitary soul, unmoored and with few, if any, connections to the immediate area. Their disappearances were disparate, unconnected dots on a map of misfortune. No one thought to draw a line between them. No one noticed the one, horrifying common thread. Their last known stop was always that lonely, creaking house in Hemlock Hollow. The boarding house that served human stew was operating in plain sight, its macabre secret simmering away, protected by the isolation of the hills and the world's indifference to the forgotten and the lost. Deputy Silas Blackwood was not from the hills. He was a town boy from the slightly more civilized county seat, a young man who had joined the sheriff's department because his body, weakened by a childhood bout of polio, had kept him from the war. He was meticulous, observant, and possessed a quiet curiosity that his superiors often mistook for timidity. While Sheriff Thorne was content to file the reports and move on, Silas was troubled. He kept a small, personal ledger, and in it he noted the names of the missing. Griggs, the peddler; Miller, the soldier; Beauchamp, the surveyor. He saw the pattern that no one else did. It was a faint whisper of a connection, a chilling coincidence that gnawed at the edges of his mind. Every inquiry he made about the missing persons led him to the same place, the Weary Pilgrim. Yet when he rode out to Hemlock Hollow to speak with Ilara Kane, he found nothing. The boarding house was clean, if Spartan. Ilara herself was polite, if unnervingly quiet. She would confirm that the person in question had stayed a night or two. She'd say they paid their bill and left at dawn, heading west or perhaps north. Her answers were always plausible, her demeanor calm. There was nothing to latch onto, nothing to suggest any wrongdoing. Yet Silas couldn't shake the feeling of profound wrongness that permeated the place. It was in the way Ilara's eyes never quite met his. It was in the unnatural tidiness of the rooms, as if they were scrubbed clean of any trace of the people who had slept in them. And it was in the smell, that rich, ever-present smell of her simmering stew, a smell that was at once appetizing and, to his senses, faintly corrupt. It was a disturbing, macabre secret he couldn't yet name. The turning point in this horrifying cold case came not from a new disappearance, but from an old memory. Silas Blackwood, frustrated by his lack of progress, began to dig into the history of Hemlock Hollow and the Kane family. He spent his evenings poring over dusty county records, birth certificates, and forgotten newspaper clippings. He found that the Canes had always been outsiders in their own land. During the Civil War, while most of the region was torn by Confederate and Union loyalties, the Canes had remained fiercely, unnaturally neutral. An old, yellowed letter from a Union quartermaster in 1864 described the family as strange folk who seemed to prosper whilst all others starve. The quartermaster noted with suspicion that the Canes always seemed to have fresh meat, even when famine had laid waste to the surrounding farms and livestock had been plundered by both armies. He wrote of a perpetual stew they kept on their hearth, which they offered to passing soldiers at an exorbitant price. The letter ended on a chilling note, mentioning that several lone scouts sent to patrol the area around the Cane homestead had vanished without a trace. It was dismissed at the time as a casualty of guerrilla warfare. But now, 60 years later, reading those words, Silas felt a cold dread creep up his spine. The pattern was older than he could have ever imagined. The family recipe, the simmering pot, the vanishing travelers, this was not a new phenomenon. It was a dark, horrifying tradition, a forbidden legacy passed down through generations. The boarding house that served human stew had been perfecting its macabre menu for decades, its history written in the blood of the forgotten. If you find these dives into forbidden history compelling, consider subscribing to our channel. The story of Alara Cane only grows more disturbing from here, as Silas Blackwood moves from suspicion to horrifying certainty. As Silas dug deeper, the folklore he had once dismissed as mountain superstition began to take on a terrifying new weight. He sought out the oldest residents of the surrounding counties, men and women with long memories and a fondness for storytelling. An old woman named Maeve O'Connell, her face a roadmap of wrinkles, told him a story her grandmother had told her. She spoke of the Hollow Eaters, a term used to describe the Canes during times of great hardship. She said that during a particularly brutal winter in the 1870s, a terrible curse had fallen upon the Cane family. They were afflicted with a constant, gnawing hunger that no normal food could satisfy. It was whispered that they had made a pact with something ancient and dark that lived deep in the oldest parts of the woods, a pact that granted them sustenance in exchange for a terrible price. "They don't eat like us," Maeve had whispered, her voice thin and reedy. "Their hunger is for the passing stranger, for the soul that won't be missed." She spoke of the strange, sweet-smelling smoke that would sometimes rise from their chimney, even when they had no livestock to slaughter. She recounted tales of travelers who checked into the Cane's Inn and were never seen again, their belongings sometimes turning up for sale in a distant town months later. Silas, a man of logic and law, found himself caught between modern disbelief and ancient dread. These were ghost stories, tales to frighten children, and yet they mirrored the disappearances he was investigating with horrifying accuracy. The macabre folklore was providing a narrative, a chilling context for a crime so unthinkable that the rational mind struggled to even conceive of it. The curse of the Cane family was no longer just a story. It was a potential motive for an ongoing, unspeakable atrocity. Silas Blackwood decided to change his tactics. Direct questions had yielded nothing but Alara Cane's placid denials. He needed another way in, a way to observe the boarding house without raising suspicion. He learned of a former boarder, a man named Finn O'Malley, a drifter who had worked at a nearby lumber camp for a few months the previous year. Finn had left the area abruptly, and Silas managed to track him down to a grimy saloon 2 counties over. At first, Finn was reluctant to speak, his eyes darting nervously as if expecting to see a ghost. But after Silas bought him a few whiskeys, the story began to pour out of him. Finn described the weary pilgrim as a place of profound and unsettling quiet. He said Alara Cane rarely spoke, communicating mostly through gestures and unnerving stares. He talked about her obsessive, ritualistic care for the large, cast-iron cauldron that sat permanently on the hearth. "She treated that pot like it was a living thing," Finn slurred, his voice trembling. "Polished it every day, talked to it sometimes when she thought no one was listening, whispered to it." Finn said he left because of the meat. He was a hunter, he knew the taste and texture of venison, of rabbit, of squirrel. The meat in Alara's famous stew was different. It was pale, he said, staring into his glass. And soft, too soft. And sometimes there were things in it. Splinters of bone that weren't from any animal I ever shot. The final straw, he confessed, was waking one night to the sound of a rhythmic, wet chopping coming from the locked smokehouse out back. The sound went on for hours, accompanied by Alara's soft, tuneless humming. He packed his bag before sunrise and walked 20 miles without looking back. Finn O'Malley's testimony, while horrifying, was still just the word of a drunkard. It wasn't enough for a warrant, not in Sheriff Thorne's eyes. Thorne was a practical man, a man who dealt in facts, not in feelings or ghost stories. He warned Silas to stop harassing a poor widow and to focus on real police work. But Silas was now obsessed. The image of Alara Kane whispering to her cauldron, the sound of late-night chopping from the smokehouse, it all painted a macabre picture that he could not ignore. He decided he had to see the inside of that smokehouse for himself. Under the cover of a moonless, overcast night, Silas rode out to Hemlock Hollow, tying his horse in a dense copse of trees a quarter-mile from the boarding-house. He approached the property on foot, moving through the woods like a wraith, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The weary pilgrim was dark, a hulking shadow against the slightly less black sky. The only light was a faint, orange flicker from the main room window, where the cauldron fire was likely kept burning through the night. The smokehouse stood about 30 yards from the main building, a small, windowless shack with a heavy, padlocked door. The air around it was still, but there was a faint, cloying smell, a mix of old smoke, iron, and something else, something vaguely sweet and rotten. He examined the lock. It was old and heavy. Picking it was out of the question. He would need to find another way. As he circled the small structure, his foot caught on something in the overgrown grass. He knelt, striking a match. It was a bone, a femur by the looks of it, far too large to be from a rabbit or a squirrel. But what was truly disturbing was the series of deep, parallel cuts near the joint, tool marks. This was not the work of an animal. This was the work of a butcher. The discovery of the butchered bone galvanized Silas. This was tangible proof, something he could take to Sheriff Thorne. He wrapped the bone in a piece of burlap from his saddlebag and rode back to town, his mind racing. The next morning he presented his findings to the sheriff. Thorne examined the bone, his usual gruff expression deepening into a frown. He recognized the tool marks. They were consistent with those made by a cleaver, but he remained skeptical. "Could be anything, son," he said, tossing the bone onto his desk. "Could be an old Indian grave someone dug up. Could be from some long-lost hunter. You can't accuse a woman of murder over one bone you found in her yard." Thorne was a product of his time and place. The idea that a woman, a seemingly pious widow, could be capable of such horrifying acts was beyond the pale of his imagination. He saw Silas's investigation as a fool's errand, a young deputy getting carried away by mountain gossip and an overactive imagination. He forbade Silas from returning to the Kane property. "Let it be, Blackwood," he commanded, his voice leaving no room for argument. "There are moonshiners to bust and land disputes to settle. We ain't got time for your ghost hunt." Silas was crushed but defiant. He now knew, with a certainty that chilled him to his core, that something terrible was happening at the Weary Pilgrim. He was on his own. If the law wouldn't help him, he would have to find another way to uncover the truth, even if it meant breaking the rules and putting his own life in grave danger. The cold case was heating up, and Silas was stepping out of the light of the law and into the shadows of Hemlock Hollow. Barred from official investigation, Silas adopted a new, more dangerous strategy: surveillance. For the next several weeks, he used his days off to secretly watch the Weary Pilgrim. From a high ridge overlooking the hollow, concealed by thick rhododendron bushes, he had a clear view of the boarding-house and its grounds. He spent countless hours in the cold and the damp, meticulously logging Alara Kane's every move in his notebook. Her routine was simple, almost monastic. She would tend to her small garden, chop wood, and fetch water from the creek. She had no visitors from the town, and she rarely left the property. The only people who came and went were the boarders, the same solitary, transient men who fit the profile of the vanished. Silas watched them arrive on foot, their shoulders slumped with weariness. He watched Alara greet them with her unnerving stillness, and he watched them enter the house, disappearing from view. He would wait sometimes for days for them to reemerge. They never did. One evening he watched as a new boarder, a man with a large canvas satchel, was shown to his room. Later that night, long after the lamp in the man's window had been extinguished, Silas saw a light appear in the smokehouse. Through his field glasses, he could just make out Alara's silhouette moving inside. There was no smoke from the chimney, but the light flickered and danced for hours. Then, just before dawn, he saw her emerge, dragging a heavy burlap sack towards a patch of tilled earth behind the garden. She disappeared from view for a time, and when she returned, the sack was gone. A few days later, Silas saw the man's distinctive canvas satchel for sale in a pawn shop in the next county. The macabre truth was becoming undeniable. The constant surveillance was taking its toll on Silas. He was gaunt, sleep-deprived, and haunted by what he was witnessing. He knew he was observing a predator at work, a killer operating with chilling efficiency. The boarding house wasn't a place of rest. It was a trap, a spider's web spun for the lonely and the lost. He needed more than just circumstantial evidence. He needed to get inside, to find definitive proof that would force Sheriff Thorne to act. The opportunity came in the form of a wicked late autumn storm, one of those violent Appalachian tempests that turn the sky to bruised purple and unleash a deluge of wind and rain. Silas knew the storm would provide the perfect cover. The noise of the thunder and howling wind would mask any sounds he might make, and the darkness would be his shield. He waited until the storm was at its peak, then made his way down from the ridge to the boarding house. The building was battered by the elements, its old frame groaning in protest. He crept towards the cellar, a part of the house he had identified as a potential point of entry. The cellar door was on the outside of the house, a pair of sloped, wooden hatches secured by a simple iron hook. It was a flimsy defense against the storm and against him. With his heart in his throat, he lifted the hook. The wind caught one of the doors, flinging it open with a loud bang that was thankfully swallowed by a clap of thunder. He slipped inside, pulling the door shut behind him, and was plunged into a cool, earthy darkness. The air was thick with the smell of damp soil, rotting potatoes, and something else. The faint, coppery tang of old blood. This was the forbidden heart of the house. Inside the cellar, the storm was a dull, distant roar. Silas lit a small oil lantern, its light pushing back the oppressive darkness and revealing a space that was both ordinary and deeply unsettling. The stone walls were slick with moisture and the floor was packed earth. Shelves lined one wall, holding jars of preserved vegetables, jams, and pickles. In the corner sat a pile of coal and a wood stack. It looked like any other cellar in the Kentucky hills, but the smell was undeniable. It was the scent of a slaughterhouse, a faint but persistent odor that the damp earth could not entirely absorb. Silas moved cautiously, his lantern held high, its light casting long, dancing shadows. He ran his hand along the stone walls, searching for anything out of place. It was then that he noticed it. On the far wall, behind a stack of old barrels, the stonework was different. The mortar was newer, a lighter shade of gray than the rest of the wall, and the stones themselves seemed less settled, as if they had been disturbed recently. His pulse quickened. He began to move the barrels, their weight groaning in protest. As he shifted the last one, he saw it clearly, the unmistakable outline of a sealed-off section of the wall. This was not part of the original construction. It was a recent addition. He pressed his ear against the cool stones but heard nothing. He pushed, but the wall was solid. There was no handle, no latch. But at the very bottom, near the floor, he saw a small, dark stain that had wicked up into the fresh mortar. He touched it with his fingertips. It was dark, flaky, and dry. He brought it to his nose. It was the smell, the horrifying, macabre smell of dried blood. Whatever secrets Alara Kane was hiding, he was sure they lay behind this wall. Silas knew he couldn't break through the stone wall alone or without creating a massive amount of noise. His clandestine mission had reached its limit. He had to get out, and he had to convince Sheriff Thorne once and for all. He carefully replaced the barrels, extinguished his lantern, and slipped back out into the raging storm, his mind reeling with the implications of his discovery. The false wall, the smell of blood, it was the final piece of the puzzle he needed. The next morning, soaked, exhausted, but filled with a grim resolve, he confronted Sheriff Thorne. He didn't just tell him what he'd found. He laid out the entire horrifying cold case. The list of missing persons, all last seen at the Weary Pilgrim, the story from the Civil War records, the testimony of Finn O'Malley, the butchered bone found in the yard, and finally the discovery of the sealed-off room in the cellar. He spoke with a passion and conviction that Thorne could no longer dismiss. The sheriff, a man who prided himself on knowing the people in his county, saw the look in his deputy's eyes and knew it was not the look of a young man chasing fantasies. It was the look of a man who had stared into the abyss. Thorne remained silent for a long time, chewing on the end of a cold cigar. "All right, son," he finally said, his voice heavy with resignation. "You've got my attention. We'll ride out there, but if you're wrong about this, if we bust down this woman's wall and find nothing but canned peaches, you'll be out of a job." Silas simply nodded. He was not wrong, he was sure of it. The boarding house was about to give up its forbidden secrets. The ride to Hemlock Hollow was tense and silent. Sheriff Thorne, Silas, and two other deputies made their way through the muddy, storm-ravaged roads. When they arrived at the Weary Pilgrim, the sun was trying to break through the clouds, casting a watery, gray light on the property. The boarding house looked deceptively peaceful. Elara Kane met them at the door, her expression as placid and unreadable as ever. She showed no surprise, no fear. When Sheriff Thorne presented her with a hastily written search warrant, she simply stepped aside, granting them entry with a silent, almost imperious gesture. As the men trooped inside, she went to the hearth and began to stir the large cauldron of stew, the rhythmic scraping of the ladle against the iron pot the only sound in the room. It was a deeply unnerving display of calm. "Ma'am," the sheriff said, his voice tight, "we have reason to believe you've made some unauthorized modifications to your cellar." Elara said nothing, her back remaining to them as she continued to stir. Silas led the way down the cellar steps, the other men following, their lanterns cutting through the gloom. The air was still thick with that same macabre smell. Silas pointed to the barrels and the wall behind them. "There," he said. "It's behind there." The deputies, now armed with sledgehammers and crowbars, moved the barrels aside and set to work on the wall. The first blow of the sledgehammer echoed through the house like a gunshot. Above them, the rhythmic stirring of the ladle never stopped. The horrifying truth was only a few inches of stone away from being revealed. The sound of destruction filled the small cellar. Stone and mortar crumbled under the relentless assault of the sledgehammers. With each blow, the air grew thicker with dust and the foul, sweetish odor of decay that seeped from the cracks in the wall. Upstairs, Elara Kane continued her slow, methodical stirring, a priestess attending to her unholy sacrament. Her detachment was perhaps the most disturbing part of the entire scene. She was not a cornered suspect. She was a patient observer waiting for a foregone conclusion. Finally, with a loud crack, a large section of the wall gave way, revealing a dark, cavernous space beyond. The stench that rolled out of the opening was overwhelming, a horrifying wave of putrefaction that made the hardened deputies gag and recoil. It was the smell of death, of old blood and rotting flesh. Sheriff Thorne, his face pale but resolute, held his lantern up to the breach. The light cut through the darkness, illuminating a scene of unimaginable horror. It was not a storage room. It was a human abattoir. Hanging from iron hooks on the far wall were several human carcasses in various stages of being butchered, stripped of their flesh like livestock. On a large, blood-soaked wooden table lay an array of knives, saws, and cleavers, their blades stained a dark, rusty brown. Barrels filled with brine stood against one wall, their contents obscured by the murky liquid. And in the corner, a pile of discarded clothing, boots, and personal effects, the final, silent testament to the vanished travelers. The horrifying cold case of the Weary Pilgrim had just become a living nightmare. Sheriff Thorne stood frozen for a moment, his mind struggling to process the macabre tableau before him. The scene was one of industrial-scale butchery, methodical and chillingly organized. This was not the work of a madwoman in a fit of passion. This was the work of a seasoned predator who had honed her craft over many, many years. The youngest deputy vomited in a corner. Silas Blackwood felt a strange, cold detachment, as if he were watching the scene from a great distance. He had known in his bones what he would find, but the reality was 1,000 times more disturbing than his darkest imaginings. He moved into the room, his lantern light playing over the gruesome details. He saw a small stack of leather-bound journals and ledgers on a small, blood-spattered desk in the corner. He picked one up. It was not a confession, not a diary of her crimes, but something far more chilling. It was a recipe book. Page after page was filled with Elara Kane's neat, looping cursive detailing methods for preparing and preserving meat. For a richer broth, one entry read, the thigh and shoulder offer the best flavor. Another entry detailed a process for curing what she called long pig, a naval term for human flesh. Silas felt a fresh wave of nausea. This wasn't just murder. It was a horrifying form of culinary art, a forbidden tradition passed down through a cursed family line. The secret ingredient to her famous stew was not an herb or a spice. It was human beings. The full, monstrous truth of the boarding house that served human stew was now laid bare in all its gruesome detail. While Silas was making his horrifying discovery in the secret room, Sheriff Thorne had gone back upstairs, his face a grim, ashen mask. He found Elara Kane exactly where he had left her, still stirring the pot on the hearth. The rich, savory aroma that now filled the house seemed like the cruelest of jokes, a mockery of the carnage that lay in the cellar below. "Elara Kane," Thorne said, his voice shaking with a mixture of rage and revulsion. "You are under arrest for the crime of murder." Elara slowly stopped stirring. She placed the long, wooden ladle carefully on the hearth, its end dripping the thick brown stew onto the stones. She turned to face him, her expression unchanged. There was no panic in her eyes, no flicker of fear or remorse. There was only a vast, chilling emptiness, a void of emotion that was more terrifying than any confession. She did not speak. She did not resist. She simply held out her wrists as if she had been expecting this moment her entire life. As one of the deputies snapped the cold iron of the handcuffs around them, her gaze drifted past the sheriff, past the door and towards the misty, brooding hills outside. It was a look of serene finality, the look of someone whose work was now complete. She had tended to her family's dark legacy, she had fed the ancient hunger, and now the story was reaching its inevitable end. The curse of the Kane family, which had festered in the isolation of Hemlock Hollow for generations, was finally being dragged out into the light. The arrest of Elara Kane and the discovery of her larder of horrors sent a shockwave through the Kentucky hills. The story spread like wildfire, carried by gossiping neighbors, breathless journalists, and horrified lawmen. The Kentucky Cannibal, the Stewpot Witch, the Butcher of Hemlock Hollow. The newspapers gave her a dozen macabre nicknames. The weary pilgrim was cordoned off, a banned and forbidden place that drew crowds of morbidly curious onlookers who stood at a distance, staring at the house as if it were a caged beast. Inside, lawmen undertook the grim task of cataloging the evidence and recovering the remains of the victims. The cellar was a house of horrors, but the rest of the property revealed even more disturbing secrets. The patch of tilled earth behind the garden, where Silas had seen Elara dragging the burlap sack, turned out to be a mass grave. Investigators unearthed the skeletal remains of at least a dozen individuals, buried in shallow, unmarked graves. Personal effects found with the bodies, belt buckles, pocket watches, wedding rings, helped to identify some of the victims from Silas's list of the missing. But many of the remains were too old, too decayed, belonging to souls who had vanished so long ago that no one was left to even report them missing. The true number of Elara Kane's victims would never be known. The roots of her family's horrifying tradition ran deeper than anyone could possibly dig. The boarding house that served human stew had been harvesting its guests for generations, a silent, macabre institution hidden in plain sight. If you are captivated by these dark, historical cold cases, please support the channel by hitting the like button. It helps us to continue unearthing these forbidden stories from the shadows of history. The interrogation of Alara Kane proved to be a maddening and fruitless exercise. She was held in a small, windowless cell in the county jail, and for days, Sheriff Thorne and a rotating cast of state investigators tried to break her silence. They questioned her for hours on end, their voices echoing in the small room. They presented her with the evidence, the tools from her workshop, the clothes of her victims, the horrifying entries in her recipe ledgers. They showed her photographs of the men she had slaughtered. Through it all, she remained perfectly, unnervingly still. She would sit on her cot, hands folded in her lap, and simply stare at a point on the wall just past her interrogator's shoulder. Her silence was not born of fear or defiance. It was something else entirely. It was a profound and total lack of connection to the world around her, to the concepts of right and wrong, of good and evil. She was an island, isolated by a sea of horrifying secrets and an ancient family curse. She offered no confession, no explanation, no hint of a motive beyond the practical culinary notes in her journals. Was it for money? The small amounts of cash and few valuables found on her victims hardly seemed worth the effort. Was it madness? Her calm, lucid demeanor suggested otherwise. Or was it something older, something more ritualistic? A fulfillment of the folk tales about the Hollow Eaters and their unspeakable pact? The questions hung in the air, unanswered. Alara Kane became a living embodiment of her own cold case, a chilling, impenetrable mystery. As Alara Kane sat silently in her cell, the town she had lived beside was tearing itself apart with fear, guilt, and suspicion. How could such a monster have existed in their midst for so long? The residents of the nearby towns, who had occasionally bought goods from her or seen her on a rare trip to the general store, searched their memories for any sign, any clue they might have missed. They recalled her strange quietness, her unnerving eyes. Men who had eaten her famous stew at church potlucks years ago were overcome with waves of nausea and self-loathing. The horror was not just that Alara was a killer. It was that she had made them unwitting accomplices in her cannibalism. The very fabric of the community seemed to unravel. Neighbors began to look at each other with suspicion. The old stories and whispers that had once been dismissed as harmless folklore were now spoken of as gospel truth. Had others in the Kane family line been involved? Did anyone else in Hemlock Hollow know her secret? The isolation that had once protected Alara now turned against the community, breeding a potent paranoia. The outside world, through the sensationalist newspapers, portrayed the entire region as a backward, savage place, a caricature of hillbilly ignorance where such atrocities could flourish. The people of the Kentucky hills, already proud and defensive, recoiled, becoming even more insular and suspicious of outsiders. Alara Kane's crimes had poisoned not just her victims, but the very soul of the land itself, leaving a legacy of distrust and horror that would linger for generations. The trial of Alara Kane was a media spectacle. Journalists and curiosity seekers from as far away as New York and Chicago descended on the small Kentucky county seat, turning the town into a circus. The courtroom was packed every day with people craning their necks to get a look at the cannibal widow. Alara entered the courtroom each morning with the same placid calm she had shown since her arrest. She sat beside her court-appointed lawyer, a young, overwhelmed man who could barely bring himself to look at her, and showed no emotion as the horrifying evidence was presented. The prosecution laid out its case with meticulous, gruesome detail. They brought in the tools from the cellar, the clothes of the victims, and the bones from the garden. They presented Finn O'Malley, whose shaky but compelling testimony about the strange-tasting meat and the late-night chopping held the courtroom spellbound. Deputy Silas Blackwood took the stand and calmly recounted his investigation, from his initial suspicions to the horrifying discovery behind the stone wall. His testimony was the cornerstone of the prosecution's case, a chilling, logical progression from unease to unearthing a monstrous truth. The evidence was overwhelming, a mountain of macabre proof that left no room for reasonable doubt. Yet, throughout the entire proceeding, the central question remained unanswered. Why? The prosecution could prove what she did and how she did it, But without a confession, the motive remained a terrifying black hole at the center of the case. The jury, a collection of local farmers and merchants, listened with expressions of stony horror, their faces pale. The defense had an impossible task. With no cooperation from their client and a mountain of irrefutable physical evidence, there was little they could do. Ilara's lawyer attempted a defense based on insanity, arguing that no sane person could commit such acts. He brought in alienists, early psychiatrists, who testified that Ilara was likely suffering from a profound mental illness, perhaps inherited, a form of moral insanity that prevented her from understanding the nature of her crimes. They pointed to her complete lack of emotional response, her unnerving detachment, as proof that she was not operating in the same reality as everyone else. They suggested that generations of isolation and inbreeding, combined with the hardships of mountain life, had created a unique and tragic psychosis. This, they argued, was not a case of evil, but of a deeply broken mind. The prosecution countered fiercely, portraying Ilara not as mad, but as monstrously cunning and sane. They argued that the methodical nature of her crimes, the careful selection of victims with no local ties, the meticulous butchery and preservation techniques, and the years of successful concealment were not the actions of a lunatic. They were the actions of a calculating and patient predator. Her silence, they claimed, was not a symptom of insanity, but the ultimate act of control from a woman who had controlled every aspect of her horrifying, secret life. The jury was left to decide whether Ilara Kane was a madwoman to be pitied or a monster to be condemned. In the end, it hardly mattered. Her fate was sealed the moment the sledgehammer broke through that cellar wall. It took the jury less than an hour to reach a verdict. When they filed back into the silent courtroom, their faces were grim and set. The foreman, a large, weathered farmer, refused to look at the defendant as he handed the slip of paper to the bailiff. The verdict was read aloud, its words echoing in the tense, packed room: guilty, on all counts of murder. A wave of murmurs and sighs of relief swept through the spectators. Justice, it seemed, had been served. But as the judge pronounced the mandatory sentence, life in prison at the state's asylum for the criminally insane, all eyes were on Ilara Kane. She displayed no reaction, no tears, no anger, no fear. She simply stood when instructed, allowed herself to be led away, and vanished from the courtroom, leaving behind a legacy of unanswered questions and a profound sense of unease. Her conviction brought a legal end to the case, but it offered no real closure. The community was still left with the horrifying knowledge of what had happened in that house, and the terrifying mystery of why. The conviction of Ilara Kane did not feel like a victory. It felt like they had merely locked away the symptom of a much older, deeper sickness that still lingered in the dark hollows of the hills. The boarding house that served human stew was closed, its proprietor condemned, but the curse, the folklore, the horrifying memory remained. Ilara Kane was transferred to the Western State Hospital, an imposing Gothic asylum that housed the state's most disturbed and dangerous minds. And there, the final chapter of her life unfolded in the same way she had lived the rest of it, in profound and unsettling silence. The asylum doctors tried every method at their disposal to get her to speak, to understand the workings of her mind. They subjected her to hours of interviews, to psychoanalysis, to the crude and often cruel psychiatric treatments of the era. They hoped to find a key that would unlock the horrifying secrets she held, to perhaps write a groundbreaking paper on her unique and monstrous pathology. But Ilara remained an enigma. She was a model patient. She followed every rule, ate every meal, and performed her assigned tasks in the laundry with a quiet, placid efficiency. She never caused any trouble. She never spoke a single word. The doctor's notes from her years of incarceration are filled with frustration. The patient remains entirely non-communicative, one wrote. Her placidity is a wall we cannot breach. It is impossible to determine whether she is profoundly insane or profoundly evil. She became a legend within the asylum walls, a silent, ghost-like figure who would sometimes be seen staring out of a barred window for hours, her gaze fixed on the distant, rolling hills, as if she could see her home in Hemlock Hollow from her prison. She was an unsolvable puzzle, a human cold case who had taken her motives and the full truth of her crimes with her into a self-imposed vow of silence. Back in Hemlock Hollow, the weary pilgrim stood abandoned, a monument to the horrors that had transpired within its walls. The county had seized the property, but no one dared to buy it. No one would even go near it. The house began to decay, its windows broken by vandals or storms, its paint peeling away entirely, its porch sagging. The wilderness, always patient, began to reclaim it. Weeds choked the garden where the bodies had been buried. Vines crept up the walls, like green fingers trying to pull the house back into the earth. The boarding house became a source of local legend, a place of grim fascination and genuine terror. It was the haunted house on the hill, the place parents warned their children to stay away from. Locals claimed that on certain nights, when the moon was hidden and the wind was right, you could see a faint light flickering in the windows, or smell the phantom aroma of a rich stew cooking on a long-dead fire. They said the spirits of the vanished travelers were trapped there, their souls bound to the place of their demise. The house became a physical manifestation of the town's trauma, a constant, rotting reminder of the macabre secret it had harbored for so long. The story of Elara Kane and her boarding house was no longer just a horrifying crime. It had passed into the realm of forbidden folklore, a chilling tale to be told in hushed voices for generations to come, a permanent stain on the history of the Kentucky hills. Deputy Silas Blackwood, the man who had brought the horrors of the weary pilgrim to light, was hailed as a hero. He was offered a promotion, a raise, and the respect of his colleagues and the community. But the case had broken something in him. He was haunted by the images of what he had found in that cellar, by the blank, empty eyes of Elara Kane, and by the sheer, unanswerable mystery of her crimes. He saw her face in his dreams and tasted the phantom flavor of her stew in his waking hours. The world no longer seemed like a rational place of law and order. He had looked into the heart of a darkness so profound that it had changed his perception of humanity itself. A few months after the trial, Silas Blackwood quietly resigned from the sheriff's department. He packed a single bag, left his small apartment, and walked out of town, heading west. No one ever heard from him again. In a strange and tragic way, he became another victim of Elara Kane, another soul who was consumed by the horrifying legacy of her boarding house. He had been the one to solve the cold case, but the solution had offered him no peace. It had only shown him a truth about the world that he could not live with, that monsters were real, and they didn't always live in the shadows. Sometimes they lived in quiet houses on lonely roads, serving warm meals to weary travelers, their smiles hiding the most disturbing and macabre of secrets. Years turned into decades. Elara Kane grew old in the asylum, her hair turning from ash to snow white, her face becoming a mask of deep wrinkles. But her silence never broke. In 1952, at the age of 78, she died peacefully in her sleep. She was buried in an unmarked grave in the asylum's cemetery, a final, anonymous end for a woman who had been responsible for so much unknown death. She took her secrets to the grave. The true number of her victims, the full history of her family's horrifying tradition, her motive, all of it died with her. Her death was a final, frustrating dead end for the historians and criminologists who were still fascinated by her case. The official records list her number of victims as 19, the bodies recovered from the cellar and the garden. But everyone knew the real number was likely much, much higher. How many lone travelers had vanished on that road in the decades before 1919? How many victims had her parents or her grandparents claimed for their perpetual stew? The Kane family legacy was a horrifying iceberg, and Silas Blackwood had only managed to uncover the very tip of it. The rest remained submerged in the dark, cold waters of the past, a chilling testament to the fact that some cold cases are never truly closed. They simply fade into the mists of history and legend, leaving behind a permanent, lingering dread. The full, horrifying scope of the boarding house that served human stew would forever remain a matter of grim speculation. With Alara Kane's death, the last living link to the horrifying truth was severed. All that remained was the house. In the late 1960s, a distant relative of the Kane family, who had no knowledge of the property's gruesome history, inherited the land through a bureaucratic quirk of county records. Seeing an opportunity, he sold the land to a timber company. The company's mandate was to clear the entire hollow for logging. The demolition crew that was sent to tear down the old boarding house was made up of locals who knew the stories. They were uneasy, working quickly, speaking in hushed tones as they brought down the rotting structure. As they tore up the floorboards of the main room, they made one final, macabre discovery. Hidden in a small, lead-lined box beneath the hearthstone where Alara's cauldron had sat for so many years, they found a collection of small, personal items. There were dozens of them. A silver locket with a faded picture of an unknown woman, a pair of wire-rimmed spectacles, a soldier's dog tag, a child's baby tooth tied with a blue ribbon, and a small, tarnished silver spoon. It was a collection of trophies, a secret hoard of mementos taken from her victims, proof that she was not just a butcher, but a collector of stolen lives. This final, disturbing discovery added another layer to the mystery. Was there a sentimental, if twisted, reason for her crimes? Or was it just the cold, detached cataloging of a predator's successful hunts? Like everything else about Alara Kane, it was a question that offered no easy answers. The discovery of the trophy box was a chilling final footnote to the story, but there was one item in it that was more disturbing than all the others. At the very bottom of the box, wrapped in a piece of oilcloth, was a single, daguerreotype photograph from the 1850s or 60s. The photo showed a stern-looking man and woman, presumably Alara's ancestors, posing stiffly in front of the newly built boarding house. They stood on either side of a large, black, cast-iron cauldron. The very same cauldron that Alara had used. But what was truly horrifying was what was in the background. Standing in the doorway of the house, partially obscured by shadow, were two small, gaunt-looking children. Their faces were pale, their eyes large and dark in the way of the chronically malnourished, and clutched in their hands they were each holding a human bone, a rib bone being gnawed on as a child today might gnaw on a piece of jerky. The photograph was the ultimate proof. The folk tales were true. The curse of the Hollow Eaters was real. This was not a crime that started with Alara Kane. It was a deep-rooted, generational tradition, a horrifying method of survival or ritual that had been passed down from parent to child. The boarding house that served human stew was not just a business. It was a family institution, its dark legacy nurtured and fed for almost a century, a macabre secret kept hidden in the isolated heart of the Kentucky hills. This photograph, a forbidden glimpse into the past, recontextualized the entire horrifying story. Today, nothing remains of the weary pilgrim. The timber company clear-cut the entire hollow, and the landscape is now covered in second-growth forest. The exact location of the house is known only to a few local historians and brave paranormal investigators. The creek still carves through the valley, but the land itself feels different, forever tainted by the memory of what happened there. The story has become one of Kentucky's most infamous and horrifying legends, a piece of dark folklore that blurs the line between fact and fiction. It is told around campfires, on ghost tour, and in the pages of true crime books. But even in its retelling, the core of the mystery remains untouched. The central question of why hangs over the tale like a persistent fog. Was Alara Kane the last practitioner of a depraved family religion? Was she simply a pragmatic monster, driven by poverty and a twisted sense of hospitality? Or was she a victim of her own upbringing, a woman raised in a world with such a warped sense of morality that she could not comprehend her own evil? We will never know. She is a void at the center of a horrifying narrative, a silent specter whose motives are as unknowable as the number of lives she consumed. The case remains a chilling reminder that the darkest parts of human history are often the ones that are least understood, buried under layers of time, secrecy, and the unwillingness of the world to believe that such horrors can be real. The legacy of this horrifying cold case extends beyond the borders of Kentucky. It has become a cautionary tale about the dangers of isolation and the darkness that can fester in forgotten places. It speaks to a primal fear, the fear of the smiling host, the welcoming inn, the hand that feeds you. Elara Kane transformed the ultimate act of nurturing, providing a meal, into the ultimate act of violation. She didn't just kill her victims. She consumed them, she incorporated them, she served their essence to others. It is a level of desecration that is almost incomprehensible, a macabre act that strikes at the very heart of our definition of humanity. The story of the weary pilgrim forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth, that the line between civilization and savagery can be terrifyingly thin. In the right circumstances, poverty, isolation, a warped tradition, the most sacred taboos can be broken. The boarding house that served human stew is not just a historical crime. It's a piece of American Gothic horror brought to life, a testament to the fact that the most terrifying monsters are not creatures of fantasy, but human beings who have, for reasons we may never understand, decided to abandon their humanity entirely. Her story serves as a permanent, disturbing reminder of the secrets that can lie hidden behind a closed door and a placid smile. And if you want to ensure you don't miss our next exploration into the darkest chapters of history, take a moment to subscribe and turn on notifications. The shadows are full of stories waiting to be told. So what are we left with? We are left with a collection of horrifying, fragmented facts, a series of disappearances in the isolated Kentucky hills, a quiet, diligent deputy whose suspicions were dismissed as fantasy, a lonely boarding house with a famous, simmering stew, and a silent, enigmatic woman who was the keeper of a generations-old macabre secret. We are left with the gruesome discovery in the cellar, the mass grave in the garden, and the chilling, unspoken story told by a faded photograph. But we are not left with an answer. We are left with a profound and lingering sense of dread. The story of Elara Kane and the weary pilgrim is a puzzle with a missing centerpiece. Her silence was her final act of power, her ultimate victory. By refusing to explain, she denied the world the comfort of comprehension. We can project motives onto her, insanity, evil, tradition, but they are just that, projections. She remains a perfect, horrifying blank slate, a mirror reflecting our own deepest fears about the darkness that can reside within the human soul. The cold case is officially closed, but the mystery is eternal. It lingers in the whispering leaves of Hemlock Hollow, in the dark folklore of the Appalachian Mountains, and in the chilling recesses of our own imagination. It is a story that, once heard, can never be truly forgotten. The tale serves as a stark reminder of the countless forgotten souls who have vanished throughout history, their stories untold, their disappearances uninvestigated. The victims of the weary pilgrim were only identified because of the tireless work of one deputy who refused to let them be forgotten. How many others, before and since, have simply disappeared into the vast, lonely places of the world, their fates known only to their killers and the silent earth that holds their bones? The case of the boarding house that served human stew is horrifying not just for its cannibalistic details, but for the ease with which it was perpetrated for so long. It exposes the vulnerability of those who live on the fringes, the travelers, the drifters, the people without roots to anchor them or family to sound the alarm. They are the perfect prey for predators like Elara Kane, who understand that the world is often too busy to notice when one more lonely person goes missing. It is a chilling thought that for every killer who is caught, for every macabre secret that is unearthed, there may be countless others that remain hidden, their perpetrators living and dying without ever facing justice, their crimes dissolving into rumor, and then into nothing. The story of Elara Kane is the story of the one that was found, a terrifying glimpse into the abyss of what may still lie hidden in the forbidden, dark corners of the world.